Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Megan Doherty. I'm the director of the Museum of the White Mountains. As we gather today, we're all on Indigenous lands. For those of you joining us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous presence in your area, both past and present. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indokina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abnaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. We're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you on Zoom, we've put a link in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at native-land.ca, as well as the Abnaki people of Northern New England through the Musée des Abnakis in Quebec. As many of you already know, as part of my research for our summer exhibition, I've been learning about efforts to preserve the culturally important brown ash tree, which is under threat from the emerald ash borer. So be sure to save the date for May 31st at 4 p.m. so you can join us for the opening reception for baskets and borers. And at our March 7th NEH Spotlight on Humanities and Sustainability Studies lecture, we learned about the important work being done by the Ash Protection Collaboration Across Wabanaki project at UMaine. If you missed that talk, I encourage you to watch it on our YouTube channel to learn more about the Indigenous-led research they are doing on the culturally important brown ash tree. Today, we continue our series. You can come on in. We continue our series, which is supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities with David Goldstein. Goldstein serves the National Park Service as the North Atlantic and Appalachian region's cultural anthropologist. His work aims to serve communities through making ethnographic work relevant and activating Indigenous co-stewardship policy on public lands. David's talk today will discuss connections between sustainability and archaeology. Please join me in welcoming David.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Museum of the White Mountains. I appreciate you guys are here, and thanks, folks, for coming inside. It's nice to see you. This invitation brought me the opportunity to return to my roots as an archaeologist. Archaeology is often not seen, but its roots sit in humanities. It seems as though it has its roots in thinking about classical antiquity and how we would use ancient Latin and Greek to understand the origins of Western civilization. And a lot of archaeological technique was really deployed in Europe and North Africa and Western Asia across the better part of the 18th and 19th centuries to develop what we now call archaeology. But in the 20th century, particularly towards the end of it, and in the period of time that as part of my world, archaeology became archaeological science. And archaeology in many ways has moved beyond just being a piece of the humanities that connects the past and the present, or the objects of the present and the past, to actually involve what is a variety of applications of social science, applications of chemical science, geological science, and what we're going to talk about today, agricultural science, in its composite to understand past societies. So what we're going to do today is explore a little bit about how archaeology can be used as a humanity and as also as a tool for interpreting sustainability. And in particular, we're going to talk about the agriculture of the neotropics. So we're going to go to Central America, and we're going to work in the Maya lowlands. But I want to talk a little bit about the mental gymnastics that I was really working on very hard about 15 years ago. And I'm revisiting a lot of ideas that I haven't looked at in some time. So this actually gave me an opportunity to sort of think about what it is that archaeology kind of offers in thinking through what's happening to our planet now and helping us to actually inform how we come up with some solutions to rethink the world that we live in particular the agricultural systems that we are using today to sustain ourselves. So with that, we'll play with this. So sustainability, it's a huge word. We use it pretty often. We're using it to drive policy decisions, and it seems to be something that is not going away. We want to be more sustainable because I think most people realize that population is increasing, and the model for growth and economic growth globally is putting a lot of stress on the systems that sustain us. The problem with the sustainability definition and the way sustainability is often authored or considered is that sustainability is about now and the future. Sustainability very rarely incorporates redressing or thinking through things that have happened across the geological past, and in particular, deep history or history with humans involved. And so it's all about sustaining for future generations, but it's rarely looking at past models of sustainability in other cultures or historically and trying to apply, make decisions about where things deviated or went wrong. So we're going to talk about a couple of different topics. First one is, what does archaeology offer studies of sustainability? Why would you look at the past to think about the future? Another one is to talk a little bit about this relative to climate change and look at some models that that sort of drive a lot of not just my thinking, but also sort of the personal way that I've chosen to live my life, and that I live my life with my family and around me through the work that I pursue in the agency. How do you think through climate change in a historical pattern? And then I want to shift, and we're going to look at some archaeological data, how it's derived, and what the data looks like from the Maya lowlands compared to how we understand neotropical agriculture. And I just want you to understand that we're going to use neotropical agriculture. So this is agriculture from the tropics of the Americas. We're going to look at that as a model, how it's interpreted, how the model is constructed. And I think afterwards, we can talk a little bit about what would that model look like in this neighborhood, and especially the work that they're doing around brown ash and thinking about the basket and boris work that I just learned about that Megan's pursuing, and also think about how we would interpret an indigenous, or what is an archaeology of the Squamish Valley or the Baker River Valley or the Pemigewasset. How would we see agriculture in this place? And that might be a discussion to have at the end of this conversation. All right. Modern climate models tend to, so there are these International Panel for Climate Change reports that come out periodically. I think we have just done 11, I think. And they are all looking at long-term interactions of gases, so carbon dioxide, of course, nitrogen. They're looking at hydrological cycles, where water is, where it's polluted, what's left, where groundwater is. They're looking at ocean currents. They look at geochemical cycles, where nitrogen and oxygen, how they cycle through the world. And they're looking at projections into the future that go 200 years out. Everything in here is chemical. There's nothing here about human beings. And there isn't really a clear way to model for human beings unless you dig stuff up, analyze it, and try to interpret it from the archaeological record. We can talk about where carbon numbers were in the past, but we can't actually talk about where people were relative to the amount of carbon they were producing in the past. And the way the International Panel for Climate Change deals with this is not very sophisticated, but it's only recent. The last 3 panels have reports have used ground cover as a model. So are there trees? Are there no trees? That's how we talk about the extent of human beings and the extent of human activity on the ground, because humans like to cut down trees. And so we do ground clearance for agriculture, right? There's this model in our head that when you cut down trees, you're creating space to grow things, to feed people. And those are big community, big social systems. They're like empires, they're cities, they're large state-driven structures to give everybody wheat and corn. And that's a very specific way that we think about how we model for human activity in the past on these climate change models. And so I'll give you an example of what we're looking at. So this is a model and a template that I come to very frequently. I try to show it. These people did this work in 2000. They didn't do the work in 2007. They printed the work in 2007. But what you're looking at is a logarithmic scale of 100,000 years ago to the present, which is 2007 in this model. And what I want you to understand is that more or less 10,000 years ago is when we believe that there's a system of agriculture that comes into being. And about 100 years ago is when, or 100 years ago is when the carbon cycle, particularly carbon dioxide and other pollutants, create greenhouse gas feedback that gets us into the current climate change problem that we're in today. And that's really only about the last 100 years. But there's an incredible amount of stability in this model for the last 100,000 years. And in there are some fluctuations. And I think you can kind of see around, around 580, between 1000 and 500 AD, there's some fluctuation in here that's actually substantial. That leads to things that I think we know as the Little Ice Age and some other activities. And in there was a lot of disruption, particularly in the European and the African systems, that were models for how societies, particular large and growing states, were able to sort of adjust or change their agricultural systems to meet the needs of the changing climate. And there are spaces in this model that you can study to try to extract how societies change or modify themselves based on ecological change. But we haven't really looked at that very well. We talk about it in a reactionary model, but we don't actually talk about it as a learning model, as to say, well, what worked for people when they were under stress versus people when they and how did they react to it, and how were they able to survive in conditions that were less than favorable. And so I want to make the argument that archaeology is really a study about the synergy between humans and the environment. It's not just about what people did in the past, the things they made, the stuff that's beautiful, the large churches, the large temples, and the myths that they made that may have carried forward to the front. They're actually living in spaces that they're in feedback with. And there's a lot to be offered, particularly in the sectors of international development and environmental change and environmental consulting, where archaeology can help inform how we write this policy and how we deploy it at different places. The things that archaeology can actually inform on are taphonomy, so how we change really the soil, how we change the kinds of trees and the kinds of different ecological levels that exist. We can talk about long-term changes in domestication. We go from, a corn that isn't even an edible corn, which is teosinte, to something that has about 800 different varieties around the Americas in less than 150, 200 years. In certain parts of the Americas. That's a very sophisticated change and a very sophisticated practice that we should be looking at a little bit more closely. Technology changes, and technology is important because most technology that we would think about really relies on wood and trees to fuel things, particularly things like food, or some things that are very important in the Americas are brewing. Making beer is actually an incredibly important social force in the Americas to actually get people to do things. Large feasts, being able to amass food and fire to make ceramics that then are used only one time at certain feasts or festivals. That's certain adaptive technology that we kind of have to understand in order to really understand the full context of people's ecological impact in the past. Human demography, we have a very bad long-term understanding of human demography across the Americas in particular. This work that was done by Denovan in 1992, there were apparently 20 million people on the North American continent at 500 years ago, when more or less when Columbus showed up here. And that number comes kind of out of the air. It's never really been fully studied. There probably are more people, and also we tend to make this conversation about North America focus on the lower 48 of the United States, because that's where people are doing the research. It doesn't really fully understand the breadth of the interactions between Mexico, Canada, the Arctic, and the lower 48. So there's a lot of work that can still be done in some of these spaces. I just want to point out that we are in 2023, and these baseline articles that I'm presenting here are all from 20 or 30 years ago. There has not been a lot of movement in studying some of these basic elemental truths about human beings in the past and their social complexity since then. A lot of things have built on it, but these are still the foundational. There hasn't been a lot of real change in theory and method in 30 years. So I have this belief that archaeologists really have yet to contribute to traditional approaches of sustainability. And the things that we can do is we can actually talk about past environments and regional scale change in ways that are very unique. We can also compare historical data to build some real case studies that show how same or similar landscapes are used differently by human society. So there's people in this room that are in class with me. And so do you see where the answer to the question to the final exam is? I put it in there, it's on number 2. It's the beginning, right? What did I say? It's comparison, right? Right, comparison. All right. So let's talk about archaeology. So in archaeology, there's an obsession with commodity crops. What you're looking at here are drawings that were made in the 16th century of people in the Andes, that's at the top, planting corn and harvesting it. So they're planting, they're harvesting, or they're planting, they're tending the seedlings, and then they're harvesting at the end. The color pictures on the end are from a thing called the Drake manuscript, which is attributed to Sir Francis Drake and a person who was a watercolorist that was on his boat, drawing pictures of particular plants. What I want you to note in all of these is that they're paying attention to an individual plant. One plant. How many people grow food in their gardens in this room? And how many different plants do you grow? Just one? And when you grow one plant, how many plants grow next to it? 12, 5, 9. We call those weeds and we try to pull them when we use them, but some people use those weeds and they have other meaning and they use them for other things. So it's not just one plant. But I just want you to see that Sir Francis Drake and Guaman Poma, who drew these things of about 500, 400 years ago, they're focusing on one plant. They're only interested in the commodity. And this is a bias that we have in our heads about the way we think about agriculture when we talk about it. We think about agriculture as wheat, as corn, as potato. And these are European interpretations of what actually is happening in these agricultural systems. And we're going to look at that in a second. Again, down below is a picture from a textbook on neotropical agriculture. So if you were going to become a development specialist working on helping people in Colombia grow better bananas, this would be in your textbook. But again, what I want you to see is that each of the individual images, except for the sort of 2 on the end, are showing you largely, or the 1 on the end are showing you, this guy, are showing you that they are largely interested in the commodity as one individual item and not as a group, okay? Focus, you got that? All right, next. And as a result, this is like a model. I just want you to get a sense is that there's this very linear model about how we think that agriculture developed. We go from a wild plant food item, we then get it to produce for us, and then we sort of systematically cultivate the one individual plant till we get to this thing that is incredible called farming and agriculture, which is this great system that we have that is largely used way out in Iowa by large, huge agricultural corporations that we depend upon to bring food and put it in the market basket for us. But largely, that model is something that has only been serving humanity for about 60, 70 years since the invention of fixation of nitrogen. And so it's a linear model. It's focused on developing from the greater whole of all the things that are in nature to focus on one individual organism to exploit it for economic good. Okay. So that gets this point down that when we talk about agriculture, particularly in the tropics, we still have this bias of looking at one individual item. However, if you looked at the average farm in a place like Peru or Colombia or Belize, where we'll go to in a minute, they're composed of 2 components. Plants and organisms that live for a very long time and are sustained through perennial systems. So there are trees and bushes, and in some cases, herbs. How many people here have ever seen a cotton tree? Has anyone ever thought about cotton living more than one cycle? So in Peru, cotton lives as a bush, and sometimes it can grow into a tree that's about 14 feet tall, and they can live for about 60 to 80 years. And that's pretty remarkable because it's not the way we think about cotton as the sort of king cotton of the American South, or India that's planted in rows and is a single monocrop that's cultivated across a large landscape. In neotropical systems, there are full stature trees. So these trees in the tropics can live for hundreds of years. And there are fruit trees that equally can live past many generations of people. So what we're talking about are sustained agricultural systems that people are using across not just their lifetime, but the lifetime of their children and their grandparents and extended generations of people. And in the middle of those are sometimes these annual herbs like corn or something called yucca or bananas or whatever else is added into that system as an individual monocrop. But largely, the things that sustain the agricultural systems in the tropics are trees. And if you looked at, and we'll look at a couple of these pictures at some point, if you looked at the system at a distance, what you would see is like, it looks like chaos. It's not the garden that you have just tended where you're looking and pulling out your weeds from around each corn plant, the tomatoes. It looks like a full stature, sometimes it's a wall of plants and you can barely see through it. I'll show you a picture in a moment of what that looks like. Why is that interesting? Well, that's interesting because what did I say? These organisms live for a very long time. And so it requires land tenure systems that people are invested in for generations. And this brings a much broader question. And this guy, Altieri, and another guy named Steve Gleesman have been writing about really from the middle of the 1980s into the present about agroecology systems. That if you looked at the component systems of the component organisms that are in an agricultural system, the kinds of things people are growing, they tell you about the society that is in fact growing them. And that the social glue is actually combined with an understanding of what the trees and organisms that make up the components of that agricultural system are. And there's a feedback between the social systems, the families that are on the land, and the plants and the organisms that are growing in these places that you cannot pull apart. And in some cases, this is sort of like, duh, that's stupid. Of course they are. Because in fact, we know that when we go in as a colonizing system or as an imperial system and we start removing people from the land to take land, which we did here in the, well, we're still doing it in this country, but across the good part of the 19th and early 20th century. And also as a lot of imperialistic countries did across Africa and other parts of the tropics, they absolutely remove people from the land. And then what you see is they replace this long-lived agricultural system and the organisms that are there with monocrops and things that they can extract for imperial use and commodity exchange. So, but once we have kind of done that work of taking people off the land and reintroducing an ag system, how do we interpret then the past if we don't have those people around and we don't have those societies and we don't even have those ecologies left to reinterpret them? How would we reconstruct that? And so this is where archaeology plays a role. So we'll talk about it. One of the things that Altieri's model sort of gets us to is that if we looked at modern agricultural systems that are directed labor, they fall with, they look at intensive focus on a single crop. They have requirements for storage. They're generally using taxation or labor extraction and sale, control and ownership of land by individual landowners. And they are often less resilient to change because they're focusing in on a single organism and a single set of land use. On the other end, this perennial system actually is organized much more freely. It's a lot more anarchic. It's a lot less structured mentally or physically in a way that you would intuit agriculture is being pursued. It does actually offer an incredible amount of predictability in terms of being resilient to change. If you have a failure in one system because of a plague or a bad drought year, you are likely to be able to still eat from something else that's in the system. It's a lot more diverse. And it also really depends on a full understanding that household economies and lineages of families have opportunities to maintain land control. And that's very different from a state-directed and a land tenure system that's land-lorded. All right, and lastly, I just want to say that there are very few people that have sort of modeled how agricultural systems are divvied up. And this is one that I had to steal from Kenya because we don't actually have this kind of type of ecosystem and the amount of land devoted to it in a household system that we could actually model in South America or in the Americas. This comes from Kenya, this model, and it has, as you'll see, it has arable. These guys have cows, so these people are using cows, and there's a lot of cows in Kenya. But so they have a lot of their land, 1.54 acres of their land in a system like Kenya goes to their cattle. Okay. But the perennial, even in this tropical system, the perennial system, the trees, the long-lived items that I want to talk about are still at a very high percentage. They're almost a little more than a quarter of the actual land use. And if you took the cows out of the system completely, it would be a third. So a third of a tropical ag system that sustains a family. And when we talk about a family here, we're not talking about 4 people, we're talking about 20. And is stable and resilient. A third of their land is being put into this perennial system to support them. All right, so with all of that in mind, let's go look at the archaeological record, and I'll give you an example, sort of more interesting. So we're going to go to Belize. We're going to go to this little weird polygon here, which is in the corner of northwestern Belize. And we'll, this isn't that sexy presentation with the pyramids and all that stuff, because we're not looking at those things. We're looking at households, we're looking at small groups. But if you were going to go look at the big sexy pyramids, you would go to these places in the nearby area, Mashna, La Milpa, Dos Hombres, Quinao, Rio Azul. These are very large sites. Like if you don't care about the Maya and you care about Star Wars, this is the rebel base territory, right, with the big pyramids at the top. We've all seen that, X-wing fighters fly up, but the guys are at the pyramids, right? That's that place. That they look like that. And in the way that people have been talking or talk about the Maya, I'm sure people have heard this, that they ran out of water. That's one. They ran out of water, so they all disappeared. The other one is that they overtaxed the land because they were focusing on corn. And another one is they disappeared because there was infighting because of resource scarcity of either food or water, created so much social friction and tension amongst the leaders that everyone sort of stopped believing in the gods, and they walked away from these ceremonial centers and they ran off into the jungle. This is the place where we're working. It's a small site called Guijaral. You can see this is sort of mound here in the background, and we're all standing around looking at it before we start digging some holes in it. There's another little mound here. It's a very small we're all standing around this thing. It's a little complex. It's a household center. In the main pyramid, when you excavate these things, you find multiple burials, generally are thought to be the lineage, the men and women and the grandparents and the ancestors of the people who supervised the land. We have these other little group out here, which is probably the household group that the family continued to live in over a long period of time, probably about 300 or 400 years. And they would go back just across the ravine here and bury their ancestors and do all the other kinds of things that they needed to do in that space. What is interesting about this is that these folks invested a lot of time and energy. You can see these like snaky things out in the hinterland here. These are a series of alburadas, walls, or dikes that funnel and move rainwater around. So this place gets about 1.5 meters of rain a year. During the rainy season, it rains pretty much a little bit every day, but it rains intensively, and it can be quite fierce, and the water will puddle quite quickly. But the ground is limestone, so it actually filters through, percolates, and goes away pretty quickly. So these are systems that these people who lived, here in this little hut, in this small little house group, they spent all their time over generations moving all the water around in this place. And they did a lot of investment in this. And so this is like, again, people are living here 300 or 400 years. They're doing a lot of investment there. The other thing that they're doing is they're having big feasts. We talk about food. So this is ceramic. This is ceramic density. So you're digging holes, shaking out, sieving out dirt, and finding bits of ceramics. And what you find is these guys are having these parties in this. They're having parties and festivals in this place where their ancestors are buried. And at the end of the day, they are taking all the festival dishes and chucking them off the back of the pyramid. And that's interesting and it's important because for years, archaeologists have been going through this stuff, looking at other people's garbage to say, guess what? For generations, they're having feasts here and they're having these parties and they're chucking all the garbage off the back. And that's what we've learned. And then we came back and we said, well, let's look at other things that they might be doing. So we came back and we did some chemistry on the soil, and this is looking at phosphates. So anyone knows what phosphates are and what they do? Phosphates are actually they're the detritus of organic waste. So it's like poop, other things like where you get rid of your garbage. This is where all your garbage loading. This is how we model for garbage loading in archaeology. And what they're saying is that they're chucking out the ceramics over here, which we saw before, but they're chucking out all the organic junk in these big pots and places here. So now we know two things about these guys. They're having parties, they're chucking things off the back, they're doing it for a long period of time, and they are also separating the garbage. They're separating the ceramic stuff from what is the organic material. And for a long time, that's how we did archaeology. We looked at the ceramics, we looked at the architecture, and we could say they're getting rid of their poop and it comes over here. This is where their garbage is. But no one ever kind of looked and said, well, what does the garbage consist of that they are, what's the organic material look like? And everyone has said, so what do you know about the rainforest? Is it a place where everything survives? Why not? It's wet, it's hot. Wet and hot generally makes sure that like everything, like this jacket would last about 35 seconds out there. Because after about a week or so, everything turns to tatters. So why would there be organic material in soil? Well, I don't know, but nobody ever asked the question. And so we started to dig these holes in these garbage pits to collect the soil and sift it. And so this is us doing all of that. And then once we do that, we put it in these bags and we look at it under a microscope. And when you look at it under a microscope, we start to find all these little flecks of organic stuff that's left behind. And you're actually able to identify them in terms of what the components of that agricultural system were in the past. Okay? And we have a lot of stuff. And what does that tell us? Well, it's a good question. Nobody had thought to look for this stuff before. And what we started to find are these like families of weeds, some things that you guys know, like so asters, milkweeds, pond weeds, amaranths. I'll tell you that 95% of the weedy species, what we call weeds, have analogs that grow in my garden here. They like the same kinds of wet cycles. Like we just went through a monsoon cycle here, like last week. We'll go through another one probably before June, and then we'll hit another good one in September and October. And a lot of those species that like that monsoon cycle stuff live in these places, and they're not like the same plant, but they are cousins, sister brothers, right? And then we also have a lot of these interesting things that are like trees. Brysonomia, which is a bullet tree. Malva, which is, these are mallows, but they grow quite tall. What we call hibiscus, like that kind of thing, right? They're a shrub. Psidium is guava. So guava, not from this part of Central America. Guava is actually from South America, but guava happens to be one of the oldest food plants used in the Americas. People were eating guava before they had corn and before they had anything else. And so what we find, what we do is we also can look at pollen series at the same time. This is a pollen section. So now we have what we call botanical macro remains, seeds and husks, and we have pollen remains, and we can compose all those things together, and we can start to actually build back our picture of what the agro-ecosystem looked like. Yeah, does that make sense? And what we start to think about is that a lot of what we want to say about archaeology in this part of the world is that there are these big pyramids and there are trees around and they cut every tree down. But really, the reality of it is that these people were living in a forest, and they weren't just living in a forest, they were living in a forest of their own making. And they actually knew what those plants were and they depended on them. And a lot of the things that they were using and eating and the things that they were throwing out in these garbage dumps demonstrate to us that that system that we saw of all the terraces, the canals, the moving of the water around, were all there to feed and take care of this land tenure system that was feeding and taking care of those people at the same time. And so there is a tradition. These are murals from Bonampak, which is a very nice site in Mexico, where these murals are still there. You have to hike out in the rainforest, but you can still see them, or you could just take pictures of them at the museum in Mexico City, which I did. And but you know, this is high culture for the Maya. You know, these are people dressed up in fabulous gear, dancing, having big festivals and feasts, and this is all the pomp and circumstance of a state. And you know, they build big pyramids and they erect stelas and monuments for their people and their kings, and all of that gets the lion's share of the attention in the archaeological record. But the reality of what's going on is that people are actually daily people like you and me, normal folks that aren't, I mean, maybe there's a king or queen in this room, I don't know, but the people who are regular Joes are living in this. And this is a woman who is living on her land in Cuba. She is, this is her, that's her house. This is her garden. This is what is sustaining her, as it has sustained her relatives and her family for hundreds of years through revolution and going back through all kinds of crazy colonial things. This is a part of, this is in Western Cuba, or Eastern Cuba. This is in Holguin, and this is a woman who has been living, her family's been living here since they can remember, and they have a variety of things that are they can eat and live with, and are part of a family system that has been resilient and survived a whole series of political turmoil over time. And so what I am trying to highlight here is that there are these other ways to think about agricultural systems, that we focus on the annual and what that means relative to state-directed power. But if we pull back and look at how perennial components demonstrate people's tie to land tenure, people's histories, it brings us to a very different kind of social science, and it brings us to an understanding about the longevity of agricultural systems, how they sustain people, and the decisions that people make to stay on their land and cultivate these plants and live with them almost as though they are their relatives. So sort of talked about this, you know, what do these kinds of household subsistence systems bring you? They give you land tenure, they give you predictable cultivation, they're resilient for provisioning, and they also allow you to schedule out your life and your year over time in ways that we don't even think about time as linear. This is a much more cyclical way of thinking about coming back to the same place in time every year rather than moving through time as a calendar. And I think there's some questions that need to be answered about what is the difference between a system like that versus a system that we live in, and how many different systems can we look at in the archaeological record to compare back as to how you can use certain plants, configure your gardens in certain ways to create different social realities that may be more resilient to the kinds of changes that the world that we're facing are bringing. So that's sort of my thesis. What we grow and how we plant plays a significant role in how we organize and maintain our social relationships. And just going back to what this is one example of, like I could probably put together a whole book of these examples from work that we have done. This particular site, I just was sort of in front of me to go back and look at this data as I was preparing to talk today. But there are other sites worth looking at. And there's a lot of material that has never been revisited under this kind of a thesis to sort of understand. And I just as an end, like I just want to show that this is these are different snapshots in time of sites in Peru, for instance. And they have the yellow is the sort of change in complexity in terms of what people are growing from perennial to annual agriculture. And in this case, the yellow are the perennial components. And then as we come closer to the present, from 6,000 in the past to 1400 BC across big sites in Peru, what you see is that the suite of plants that are annual get incorporated into these foundational systems that were perennial systems at the beginning. And the perennial system is like the basis of agriculture. And then these other bits get added on as other people decide that they want to focus on certain products and certain plants. Anyway, that's what I have prepared for today, and that's what I want. Yeah. The thing that comes to mind here is like sugaring. So the two sugaring, and thinking about where we are here. Like so, like I'm writing this up, and I'm looking out my window, the river, and so the sugaring, all those sugar stands, the sugaring stands that we have in this region are places that people took care of for a really long time. They've been here for a while. The other one is like, you come across in the whites, these big stands of blueberries. They're not just there because, they're there because bears are there, they're there because squirrels are there. They're also there because people are there. And there is a relationship between the kinds of things we come across in the whites that relate to these sorts of systems. And we don't have a good record right now of where the towns and the sugaring sites and the towns and the blueberry stands, and the towns and all the birch stands, all the other things that we would be using if we were from here 500 years ago, where all of those things are. But my intuition is that there is a whole way to reconfigure and rethink about this landscape that we live in relative to this system to look for places to live. If you were in Northern England as an archaeologist, you would be trained to walk across a fenland or a moor, and you would be able to see where different settlements or houses used to be because you could see where the plants are. And we lost that here. There are people who still have that knowledge in this neighborhood, but we've lost that here. But it would be nice to work on trying to reconstruct that, to see this landscape as a productive landscape. Yeah.
Two things. One is, even though I know what everything is, that fewer people are going to archaeology and anthropology.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about doing data analysis and new research, we're limited in terms of people that are going out. Even though I feel like it can be really important. But the other thing is, as we learn new things about sustainability, climate change, gender roles, things like that. Is anyone looking at data interpretations from the past with the new lens of like the discoveries we've made in sort of more recently?
In terms of which, sorry.
Well, I'm thinking of how we may have interpreted like land use, or even the waste in certain sites, and how those were interpreted in the past might have a different
interpretation now. Yeah, no, not so much. It's hard because empire building for archaeologists was a focus. So you want to talk about how large fields of grain fueling an empire to make them work. And if you start to look at large fields of grain as being less than large fields of grain, and you start to look at them as a multi-component system, it tends to make people less inclined to support an imperial theory that everything's owned or controlled by a centralized government. That's real. That said, there's a fabulous project that's that they did. I mean, the Europeans had so much money, right? So they did this huge project where they looked at the fall of the Roman Empire, and they've looked at it through landscape archaeology and they looked at it through land tenure and land use. And one of the things that they one of the people that were doing the sort of archaeobotany piece of that work began to describe that as Rome became less centralized, you see people moving to multiple crop systems in their fields. They are less interested in growing extractive things, and you see less of a focus on wheat and grain exports off people's land, and you see more of an intensification of perennial agriculture in systems, particularly in southern France, and places where the Roman Empire starts to lose its control, its centralized control. So what you see is that the argument there is that families that have land tenure over time, if they are starting to lose touch with the centralized government, are starting to grow their own stuff and grow more things differently and investing in long-term, long-lived organisms and not just simply monoculture, which is very interesting.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat about what might you suggest that we do to apply your very interesting perennial plant theory to today?
Right. So grow more trees, spend more time with them, and diversify if we want to survive. So there is this thing called the Green Revolution where developing countries went to, or the developed West went to developing countries and said, you need to plant this kind of rice and invest in large-scale rice agriculture. And those are places where there's a lot of family land tenure, and they said cut down trees and grow rice instead. And that plan in the 1970s and 80s sort of completely fell apart. The antidote to that in our world now is to say, like, well, it's one thing to be depending on, again, where am I getting my food? I'm getting my food right now from, Longview Farm, Quincy Road. That's where I'm getting food. But I'm not getting food from them right now. I'm only getting food from them 6 months of the year. So what am I doing the rest of the time? Well, I'm going to the marketplace. Why? Because I'm not preserving food at home and I don't actually have enough to draw on in the spring and the fall to diversify to keep myself alive. I can't do that. So there needs to be a thought to how we are going to consider extending growing seasons and also consider extending different kinds of organisms that we grow. And we would need to look at the archaeology and the indigenous knowledge from this place to build that into our systems here to make living here sustainable. I think that's how I would apply that.
So I do want to mention, because I'm on the board of Parade, the Very Renewable Energy Initiative, which has local food to Plymouth, which is online, so you can get food extended beyond 6 months. But I was also thinking of, trees as like perennial plants. Yeah. And I was thinking of Rob Sanford, who's archaeology at University of Southern Maine, wrote a book, Rural Landscape, which is sort of equivalent to Tom Wessel's Forest Forensics. And so they both kind of talk about interpreting, because Rob was an archaeologist, archaeology training. And so I've been out in the field with Rob, and it's kind of fascinating to have him tell you what happened on that land that has now become forest again,
right?
From agricultural practices. So, I mean, those are just two really good resources that, in my mind, connect with what you're talking about. And then I just think of all the initiatives with permaculture now, with what you just said about identifying edible substances that most people would never consider food. And that's one thing that Larry's trying to do with that cooking show, is feature recipes for these plants that can grow here indigenously. Yeah.
And not just like, I mean, again, it's like living in Brooklyn, everyone's like making garlic mustard pesto, but they're pulling out of the park, or going after, shoots of Japanese knotweed when they first come up. Like, what about the things that should be growing here that aren't just the invasives as a cycle?
Well, and there is a lot of sensitivity too about foraging and how to forage without being too extractive.
Being too extractive.
Yeah.
And then there's But, and then there's this question of like, foraging is a piece of this, but then what's the other piece of creating like a perennial investment? Like, that's a piece that's sort of the next step off of it, right? There aren't enough ramps for everyone to go pull
Right.
them. But what would be the ramp that we could pull from?
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about sort of working with indigenous constituents and indigenous communities, and one of the, just because we were talking, it's like I was just mentioning the polygon, Japanese knotweed, right? And you know, one point I don't know, of course, we got into a conversation about how do you deal with invasives in a indigenous knowledge, and the comment was, well, change happens. We've been dealing with change for a really long time. The landscape's changed since the creator brought a lot of things here. And these not what you're calling invasives, some of them are a real pain in the neck, but some of them are actually useful. And so if they're useful, we use them. And I'm like, oh, that's an interesting idea. But there's not anything that isn't really worth considering for its use if it's in front of us. And I think sometimes we're quick to eradicate rather than negotiate. Just a thought.
How would you say you would implement like basically your suggestions to like use the resources around you when we're in an area that is so like urbanized,
Yeah.
like so many parts of like the United States, like it's hard to like use our resources around us because we kind of got rid of all of them. So what would you say like the future steps towards that would consist of?
I think it's access. One thing is access. So
But like we slap like pavement wherever.
right, we separate what we do,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, again, working like in the landscape architecture frame, a lot of the work that I do now, we see people saying, oh, we'll do greenscapes. I'm like, great. How about greenscapes with things you can eat? You know, how about greenscapes with things that produce something that you can use for energy sustainably? Like, let's think that, not just like, oh, well, no longer are we gonna have hardscape. So we got over that hump, but now let's get to having access to some things that are, I mean, I don't know whether we're making wheatgrass juice out of the place I'm parking the car, but maybe we're moving in that direction. I don't know. My family, we lived in the Virgin Islands for about 6 years or 4 years, and in that space, like their mango trees are along the side of the road, and people use those and they sell them back to someone. It's the guy who showed up and would show up with fruit, and the fruit is just from stuff that he's grazing off the road. And there are very few things in a place like that you can't eat. Like this place that we were looking at in Belize, in that neighborhood, you can eat everything. You can eat everything. It's pretty amazing. It's very hard to starve in a rainforest. It's really hard to starve in a rainforest. And it's hard to starve. It's hard to starve in this forest too. I mean, this is a great forest. But it is hard to starve. Yeah.
I mean, there's policy, I know even in Hawaii where it would be more like the countries where there's policies that prohibit or make it hard for people to have edible grows and stuff like that. So there's huge barriers, I think, too,
Sure.
that we need to overcome in order to get back to that, where we can forage in our communities. The campus could grow edible trees like crazy, you know.
We get a pawpaw on every corner, right? Yeah, it's we were just planting fruit trees yesterday, and so why don't we just put the tree right here? Well, you don't want fruit that close to the house. Like, all right, but why? I mean, I think that policy barriers, but I also think access too. It's like trees are expensive, they cost a lot of money, you need water. Water's expensive. I mean, we're just not set up for it. It's hard, as you said, like we're urbanized, we're connected to this economy that's about money for food. Like we do this. Rethinking that is that's a big rethink. But I want to go back to what Altieri was suggesting, is that it's a both and. It's not just a policy fix. It's also a rethinking how families are structured and organized, how the community makes decisions. All of those things facilitate the support of a perennial ag system. And so it's not, I mean, it's like we're individualized, like I want to spend money or a couple of people or my family, but there's a community organization around that has to be set up to also have the right organisms in it, the right kinds of plants, and then also the right kind of policies, sort of a three-legged stool. Yes.
About 5 years ago, David Holbrook published a book called Retro Suburbia.
That's cool.
Are you familiar
No,
with
I
this?
don't know.
I had the pleasure of visiting his home in Australia.
Alright.
And
Cool.
his ideas in this book were exactly what you're talking about.
That's interesting.
And what he addressed in this book was not just how to use the growing space that's possible as a landscape architect might do, but how all of the systems have to also change. How people live together, sharing spaces, how families operate, how the whole food access as well as production and preservation and distribution systems have to change. So it's kind of a big task, but not impossible. And apparently there are quite a number of places and spaces in Australia that are making some of these changes. But right here, we have Marianne, probably, we've done this housing study and looked at changes to our planning documents around what spaces locally are available for more housing, but more housing means fewer farms.
Yeah,
We've lost so much farmland
I've lost a lot of farmland here.
in this
Yeah.
area. We've got to get this information to the policymakers to preserve the growing spaces, because you can't do it one lot at a time necessarily.
But interesting, what's the guy's name? What's his retro
Retro
suburban?
Suburbia, David Holbrook,
Okay,
he's one of the originators of permaculture,
okay,
so he's taken it to another generational level of this.
interesting.
So I have a related question that I might feel off base, but I feel like it kind of brings together what you're doing with the Park Service and what you're talking about today. So I wonder about cultural appropriation in the permaculture conversation, which I don't think I had thought about before we started talking about neotropical lowland, essentially food forest, right? Like it gets talked about in the kind of permaculture space as the food forest. But so can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on cultural appropriation in permaculture? And you could be like, Megan, I've never thought about that before this moment, and
Well,
I'll write you an email next week, and that will be a perfectly fine answer. But I'm just thinking about it a lot as you've been talking.
I'm thinking about like Vinanda Shiva's work and the things that are happening in India where you have farmers revolting because of intellectual property law. Right? The intellectual property law around these ideas of how we use things is very difficult to talk about in a context of the United States because there's no protection for intellectual property except for the patent. And why I say that is that, like, so in Australia, we were just talking about, there is law that protects indigenous knowledge at the federal level, as there is in actually most countries, save for the United States. So Peru worked for a long time. They were very proprietary about every potato that comes out of the country, and that's all intellectual property. It's preserved by the state. But it's acknowledged that it's cultural patrimony, which is another piece. In the Belizean space, there's very fraught politics because it's a very colonized country. Maya are relegated to the poor Maya communities that live in Belize are relegated to a very low status, and land tenure is a very hot topic because it's a very colonized land, it's very colonized. And so the systems of agriculture that my communities use are protected by intellectual property law. But they're also seen as lower in status, and so people aren't interested in stealing their stuff in the same way, right? So that's a thing. But I think in the United States or in the West, I think we're entering a space. So the Department of Interior is producing Indigenous knowledge policy for the country right now. That is coming out this year. And what is that gonna say? It's gonna say that anything that the federal government does with Native people that has the idea, is taking an idea from Native people, must be attributed to them. There has to be a cost benefit. There has to be a benefit, a community benefit back to the community from which that idea came. And that is outrageous. I mean, it's huge that that's happening in this country. It's done in this way that the federal government navigates our economy, and that it will only apply to federal projects. It won't apply to, it can't apply to the public sector. But it would be, it is as close to that kind of acknowledgement. And it will be very tricky for something like the United States Department of Agriculture. How are they gonna innovate, use Indigenous knowledge to do permaculture work, right? And at the same time, recommend that to other people as a practice that aren't Native. I'm not sure how that's gonna go. But I'll say we're getting, I spent a lot of time working in this space where Native people are tired of having their stuff stolen. They don't want to have it stolen anymore. They're very happy to be recognized for the achievements that they've made to be able to survive and be resilient. And they want that, they want their knowledge known. That's another piece. And as long as there's a benefit to it, and there is respect in that relationship, I think it will go okay. It's when things get, it's like, well, in the Banana Shiva example, when the neem tree gets hoovered up by the whole state of India and said that the state of India is going to make money using neem and neem oil as a export crop that's going to generate capital for Monsanto, that's when things get crazy. And I think we could see that in this country. But I think we're moving into a space where if we can stay cognizant of what Indigenous people have offered to steward land in the spaces that non-Native people are looking at, it should be okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you again for joining us. We have one more NEH Spotlight on Humanities and Sustainability Studies event this semester. It's on May 1st at 4:30. So be sure to join us for that, and thank you for your support, for joining us. Those of you who are members for the museum, we appreciate your support, and we couldn't do all of this without it. So thank you, and thank you, David, for joining us.